Okay, hopefully you guys are doing well. Today we will move on into Renaissance and the beginning of modern philosophy, which is probably overall more interesting than ancient philosophy, but in order to understand modern one, the ancient was necessary. The medieval philosophy we only talked about a little bit last week, but like I said, there's really not much time to dwell on it. However, it also is important. So for this reason, we will begin as usual by trying to, first of all, refresh your memory about what did we talk about last time, and also give you a chance for extra credit and prepare you for the exam. So let's take a look at these questions. The first one: what event happened in the 13th century causing a significant shift in medieval thinking? Suppose that this is on the exam, what would you say? What happened there? Now, we talked about 13th century, we talked about Thomas Aquinas, but that's not exactly what the question is asking, because it's more of a shift in thinking than just one person. Okay, well, the rise of the universities, they did kind of become more prominent in the 13th century, although they were present even before 13th century in some way. But that itself is related to another important event. Renaissance later on, not 13th century. Renaissance we'll talk about today, it's really more of a 14th century than 13th. It happened after. Now again, it is all kind of related. The availability of the works of Aristotle and Plato, remember we talked about it, they were kind of lost for the most part. They had a little bit, but majority of them were lost. That in itself is what actually pushed, first of all, the universities into existence. So they already kind of had some sort of structure there, but to become more formal, they needed this kind of a push. And remember, the push was that the works of Aristotle were compared to the Bible, and they tried to work out this universal outlook, which is exactly what Thomas Aquinas was doing. And it also gave a start to Renaissance, we'll talk about today. Okay, what did Aquinas believe concerning the effects of sin on our rational capacity? Now here what is also important is to remember, what did Augustine believe? St. Augustine, what did he think about the effects of sin? And that should help you remember what did Aquinas believe. Right, well, this is what Aquinas believed. So how about Augustine? What are our faults? The spheres of, effects. The question is, did sin affect our rational capacity? So the question already been more or less answered. I will give that extra credit to Alan. I'm sorry, it's trouble pronouncing your name. Alan Tsehe. Yeah, so that's pretty much correct. This is what Aquinas was saying. So this is in this case the correct answer, that we can use them. But what was Augustine saying before that? Remember, Augustine lived many, many centuries earlier. Okay, yeah, thanks. Do you guys remember what Augustine was saying? Why did Aquinas even address that? Because there was already a position that original sin damaged our rational capacities. Right? We became stupid because of the original sin. And so only a grace from God can help. And this is where it's important that Aquinas actually disagreed with that and said, no, actually, you know what? You can successfully have reason regardless of the grace of God. Everybody has that. So no need for the grace of God. Original sin only affected our moral capacity, not our reasoning. Okay, how about how, according to Thomas Aquinas, do spheres of reason, faith and reason relate to each other? Now that should be easy, hopefully. If you remember anything about the last lecture, that should immediately come to mind. Well, different roads leading to the same goal, but how do the spheres themselves relate? It's a little bit like, remember what I was saying. Okay, so they overlap. So if this is, let's say, the faith, and this is the reason, they kind of overlap. You may also say that they lead to the same goal, but remember we had this slide with the overlap. This is like point B, point C, point D, whatever. So you have some part which you can approach either through faith or through reason, such as, for example, the question of the existence of God. You can read it in the Bible. The Bible says God exists. End of story. So that would be through faith. So if this is faith, okay. But you can also use a different road. You can use your reason. And then you get the same result. You can also find out that God exists. Now note that he also said there are certain things, such as what is here, which you cannot use your reason to understand. The examples would be Holy Trinity. Why is there 3 gods rather than 1? That's not exactly something you can just reason your way into. Just read the Bible. That's what the Bible says. There are 3. And they are in the same time 1. The God Father, the God Son, and the Holy Spirit. Now there are also things which you really don't need the Bible for, because Bible is not very helpful, such as the law of gravity. Right? That is this part of this line of reason which doesn't overlap at all with the faith. So in other words, overlapping. That is how they are related. Okay, what are the Aquinas' 5 ways? Now that should be very easy. Motion, cause, necessity, degree, and design. 5 ways. Well, but what is it? The question is not as specific as that. You don't have to list them, but just what are the 5 ways? Exactly, proving God's existence through reason. Good job, Louis. So, yeah, that they are through motion, cause, necessity, degree, and design. But there's a simpler answer. They are there in order to prove the existence of God. So that's what they are. Okay, and finally, what was Aquinas' view on the ontological argument for God? Now that may be a little bit difficult. You have to remember what was the ontological argument and what was his view about it. To give you a hint, it was not his argument. Well, again, that's a little kind of more specific than I'm asking for. This is the explanation why they fail, but the more simple answer is they fail. That's his answer. He says they fail. Exactly, that's why. Yes, because we can't know the nature of God. So proving the nature of God through the definition. Remember, that's the ontological argument. The definition of God means that if you understand the definition, you know he exists, because if you have 2 possibilities, God which exists, God which doesn't exist, which one is greater? Well, St. Anselm was saying clearly the God which exists is greater than the God which doesn't exist. But what's the definition of God? It's the greatest thing. So he was saying, by definition then, if you understand the definition of God, you know he exists. But Aquinas was saying, no, it fails. Why does it fail? Well, because you have to really be knowledgeable. You have to be a very knowledgeable person to understand the nature of God, and we, unfortunately, at least most people are not, so that would not be good enough for most people. It would only be for the learned people. So the argument fails because we do not have a perfect apprehension of God's essence. Okay, so now we can move on to the modern period. This is a nice little illustration here. Beginning of industrial era, but we first talk a little bit about Renaissance. Renaissance, the kind of a dividing line there, which usually you can draw for Renaissance, is the Black Plague. The great Black Plague of Europe, which was between 1347, 1349. Now we live in a pandemic, so we have a little bit of an idea how it was like, although it was much worse back then, because for one thing, they had no idea how to even prevent it. They tried to wear some sort of masks. You probably saw this kind of funny long nose type things, but for some whatever different reason, they thought if you put some grass or whatever inside, that will prevent the plague. But they did not know that you should wash hands, and they did not have soap. So that was a huge spreader. If somebody died, if somebody was sick, they would not wash their hands after touching the dead body, the same objects which dead body touched, and then they would eat with these hands and do other things. So it was spreading like a wildfire, and it was very deadly. It was hell a lot deadlier than coronavirus. The exact numbers we don't know. What we do know is that Europe was pretty much depopulated. Most people died. And that actually served rather well for the ones who stayed, because after the whole thing was over, working hands were in huge demand, so the wages rose, people became wealthier, there was more land, there was more of everything, because, you know, if before there were 10 people and now there's one, well, that one basically inherits everything that 10 people had. So that is kind of a dividing line. Renaissance itself means rebirth. Roughly the period of Renaissance is between 1350, right after the Black Plague, and 1650, which is more or less what we will be talking about next time and even in the end of this class. So we don't dwell on it. Why not? Well, it's mainly in terms of history of interest more than philosophy. However, we still have to mention it because it was like a reawakening of human spirit. There were several important developments which affected philosophy immediately. So Renaissance humanism, that's one of them. Again, if you take history class, they'll talk a lot more about that. Humanism kind of, you can look at it as a confrontation with scholasticism. Remember we talked about scholasticism last time. What did scholastics do? In the universities, this is mainly in all the universities in Europe, they basically did what Thomas Aquinas was doing. They were trying to understand the nature of God and kind of square it off with philosophy of Aristotle, Plato, and so on. Now, humanism had somewhat of a different approach. Most humanists were either not affiliated with university at all, or if they were affiliated, they were affiliated with universities in Italy. Why did it make a difference? Well, in Italy, whereas in England and France, most of the universities saw themselves as basically theological institutions to prepare future priests and people who were interested in God. In Italy, they actually had somewhat more of a medical orientation. Most degrees they were awarded were in medicine. So Italian universities, Padua, Bologna, turned out to be a lot more free in this sense because they were not as worried about God. They could look at other questions which, again, you could use those works of Plato and Aristotle to understand. And that's why they kind of started this whole humanism. In fact, today, when you take certain subjects and they're called humanities, right? History, philosophy, those are all humanities. They actually are going back to this whole movement of humanism. And another thing which they were doing, scholastics did read Aristotle a lot. Not as much Plato, Aristotle. But they did so in Latin translations, which were pretty bad, and they also took a very, very kind of mechanical approach to it. Humanists tried to read in the original Greek, both Plato and Aristotle. Plato especially, because remember, Plato is a lot more artistic. His works are a lot more exciting, you may say. So reading him in Greek also felt a lot more like something humanitarian would be doing. And for this reason, they kind of drifted into this different direction. Now, those Greek manuscripts, the original manuscripts, was spreading more and more works of Plato, complete dialogues of Plato became available, and that actually kind of swung the whole thing towards Plato, and there was this anti-Aristotelian reaction. A lot of people were looking at Aristotle as something backward at this time. They thought that the scholastic idea of trying to figure out the ideas about God from the works of Aristotle was just completely misguided. It was slowly emerging over the centuries. One big thing which actually happened and had huge effect in this time is printing press. The invention of the printing press, which happened in 1447. Why did it have a huge effect? Well, you can probably imagine. Prior to that, they were handwriting all the books. This is literally what they were doing. If you wanted to make a copy of a book, you had to sit down with a pen and a paper and rewrite the whole thing. As you can imagine, it's a very painful, slow process. Mistakes can be made, but even if you don't make mistakes, you're not going to accomplish very much. So 45 copists under Cosimo de' Medici, working for 2 years, produced as a result only 200 volumes. For 2 years, these 45 people were making those copies. Cosimo de' Medici, the Florentine banker, was paying them good money for that, and the result was 200 copies. Now, to compare with that, as soon as they invented printing press, by 1500 in Europe, there were 9 million books, 30,000 titles. Why? Because you know how printing goes. And it's actually similar to how it was, well, all the way until the computers. First they make like a backward kind of copy of a page. All the letters are on that kind of like a stamp, and then they just take different pages of paper and they keep on stamping them very, very quickly, and then they sew them together into a book. So that process obviously is hell a lot quicker than handwriting it. And for this reason, what happened? Books became cheaper, a lot more widespread, more people could read them, more people could use them. Regular people, not just wealthy people, were able to purchase them for their own at-home libraries and read Plato, Aristotle, whatever else. So naturally it had a huge effect on the society. Society overall became a lot more educated. Rise of individualism. Now, like I said, there was slowly growing significant rejection of this scholasticism, of this methodical study of Aristotle and the Bible. Classical style was hell a lot more free and, you may say, inventive, artistic than that. So that in itself gave rise to more individualism, more of an individual thinker. A person who, for himself or for herself, could read Plato, for example, and make their own mind about what he says, rather than just listening to a professor at the university who would kind of like just laid out for them. Changes in art. Now this is some of the first ones. When it first began in Italy, 14th century, art actually was the first affected. Slowly it kind of really grew into other areas, including science. Science quite a bit later was developing. But the beginning, 14th century, that is changes in art. If you take art history class, they'll take hell a lot more about that. So what exactly happened? Medieval art, highly symbolic, mostly about the Bible. If you look at the medieval paintings, almost all of them have Christ, almost all of them have some sort of biblical situations, and they are not very realistic. They are somewhat more of a simplistic. Now, during the Renaissance, classical themes, contemporary subjects started to become subjects of art. Why? Well, they also learned quite a bit more about what Greeks were doing. And Greeks, remember, Greek sculpture in particular was not of gods. They had some gods, sculptures of gods, but mostly they were portraying human beings. So that kind of had a huge effect. This is an interesting kind of work of art to mention in this regard. If you ever go to London and British Museum, hopefully after the pandemic, you can see it. It's interesting in many ways. It's from 1533, so it's kind of quite a bit into the Renaissance. Hans Holbein the Younger has painted it. It's called The Ambassadors. Now, what is interesting about this painting? Hans Holbein the Younger was actually court painter for Henry VIII. So what exactly is interesting? Well, if you look at it, there's several very interesting things. One of them is this. What do you think it is? You probably can figure it out, right? What is it? A skull. But note that it's not really a normal representation of a skull. Actually, what you can do if you ever go to the museum itself is you can stand, many people do this, you can stand from here on this side and look in this direction, and then it exactly looks like a skull because of the, the way it projects. If you look at it straight up, it looks distorted, but if you look from that point of view, if you stand next to the painting and look down like this, it looks normal. It looks like a normal skull. Now that's one interesting thing. The other interesting thing, if you look closer at the entire painting, you will see all this stuff which already is rather scientific. All these kind of instruments which scientists are using to study the globe, the books, and all this other stuff. So that already tells you that the learned people of at the period, those at least who had money, were interested in things other than God. But there is another little thing which you may not immediately notice. Usually you need somebody like a guide to point you to that. And this is also very interesting and very telling. Here, what do you think this is? Can you see it? No, it is actually a crucifix. It's Jesus on the cross. Now, what is especially interesting about it, where it is. Is it in the center? No, it's all the way in the back, behind the curtain. It's barely poking out from the curtain. So that tells you what was going on at that period of time. God was no longer center focus. God was kind of going back. He still was there. Naturally, most people still believed in God, cared about God, and so on, but God was no longer at the center. So the painting from 1533 already kind of tells us the story which we today can just repeat. So Protestant Reformation, which happened around this time, I mentioned it last time, somebody asked about it, very important event. The book talks about it. So what happened with the Protestant Reformation? Well, the one important event, of course, Martin Luther, Augustinian monk, nailed his famous criticism, the 95 Theses, to the door of Wittenberg Castle in 1517. What was he Protestant against? Catholic Church. He thought the Catholic Church was corrupt. A lot of people had problems with what was going on at the time with the Catholic Church. It slowly became more and more corrupt. If you, again, heard about the Borgia Pope, there is actually I think Showtime has this mini-series on Borgias and what was going on. He had a mistress. He was living lifestyle of a wealthy playboy rather than the Pope. That was right before this. And this is one of the reasons this whole thing happened. Because many people who, like Martin Luther, still believed in God, thought that what church was doing was not right. The Catholic Church, the Church of Rome, was completely corrupt. The priests were selling indulgences. So basically, you could go to a priest and say, I have sinned, I've done something, I slept with, I don't know, my best friend's wife or something, right? How much would it cost me to have it removed? And the priests, who supposedly had, direct line to God, would tell him, okay, that will be, 100 florins. And that person will pay them, and they'll say, okie dokie, then no more problem. We will have a word with God, and so don't worry about it now. You can imagine how cynical that must have sounded to people who truly believed in God. Clearly, those priests were just making money rather than, being true members of the church. Another problem is the Bible, up until then, it was completely translated into Latin language because, remember, the Old Testament is originally written in Hebrew, New Testament in Greek. They translated the whole thing into Latin. They never translated it into other languages. So who could read the Bible? The priests. That's what they were actually learning in university, how to speak and read Latin. Nobody spoke Latin at that period outside of the universities and the church, because at 16th century, it was not a living language. There was no country which spoke Latin. Italy already at that point spoke Italian, which somewhat similar, just like Spanish to Latin, but it's not the same language. So who could read the Bible? The priest. Why was it convenient for the priest? Well, because again, like if you can't read the Bible, you don't even know what the Word of God is, who do you go to ask about that? The priest. And he again can charge you for it and make himself a living by kind of helping you out, explaining to you the Word of God, which you yourself do not possess. So among those, this is among the most important reasons why Reformation even happened, is because people felt like this is not right. There's something wrong with this whole situation. Why can't we just read the Bible in English or in French? Why can't we just talk to God directly? So this is what all these Protestant divisions within the church basically were about. And today you have this Presbyterian church, and there's a whole number of them. They actually did kind of disagree with each other. John Calvin in Switzerland started Calvinism. That's one of the Protestant movements. In England itself, it was even more interesting, because what happened in England is related to Henry VIII. I don't know if you guys ever heard this story. Again, there's a mini-series if you want to watch it, about Henry VIII and his wives. Essentially what happened is he didn't even want to introduce Protestant religion into England. But what he did want is to divorce his first wife, who was Spanish princess. Why did he want to divorce her? Because he wanted a son, and she could not give him a son. She gave him a daughter, Mary, but not a son. So he wrote to the Pope of Rome and asked him for the divorce. The only way at that time to get a divorce was to get a permission from the Pope. Now, the Pope even though it was a request from King of England, said no. Your wife is perfectly healthy. There's nothing wrong with her. So you can't divorce her. Too bad you don't have a son. I don't care. Now, King of England, being the King of England, thought to himself, hey, why do I even ask somebody? I'm the King of England. And he declared himself the head of the Church of England, which was kind of this move which created the Church of England. Church of England is a lot like Catholic Church, with one important difference. Instead of the Pope, the head of the Church of England is King of England. So then the Catholic religion in England was generally suppressed. Also a lot of money was taken from the monasteries and so on. That's a little bit more of a subject of a history. What is interesting now is that because of that, again, England became Protestant. Because Anglicanism, the Anglican Church, is considered Protestant Church rather than Catholic Church. So all this stuff was happening, and this is part of this Protestant Reformation. Note that again, last time somebody asked about Roman Catholics. Well, some people remained loyal to the Pope in Rome. Those are the Roman Catholics. But there's a whole range of these Protestant denominations which became prominent at that time. Now, rise of modern science. A little bit later than Renaissance itself. Renaissance at first didn't, like I said, wasn't very closely connected to science. It was mainly connected to art. However, it still gave that a push. So eventually, scientific revolution began. One interesting example, which we are mostly interested for this class, is Copernican revolution. What was the Copernican revolution? Well, prior to Copernicus, it was the common system which accepted all over Western Europe was the system of Ptolemy. Ptolemy of Alexandria, 2nd century our time, has basically written that solar system is the Earth at the center. So this would be the Earth. And then the sun revolves around the Earth, which makes sense, right? You see it revolving. And other planets also revolve around the Earth. But there was one problem with it, which is exactly why Copernicus has disagreed with this system. What was the problem? Well, as we now know, and you hopefully guys know too, that's actually not the case. What is actually happening is the sun is at the center, and then the Earth is just one of the planets circling the sun. Now, what would be the problem if you think that the Earth is at the center? The problem would be the planets will not be circling the Earth in circles. They'd be going more like this. Do you understand why? Because the Earth is not at the center, right? So if you are here and you're looking at this planet going around the sun, it's not going to be going around you. It's going to be making this kind of a weird type of movement. Because it's not going around you. So that was problematic. And Copernicus supposedly also was a Platonist, and for Plato, the perfect shape is a circle. Yeah, well, there were a number of problems, but for him the main reason was this. So he actually challenged that. In 1543 he published this book right before he died, by the way. I think it was actually published when he already was dying, because he was a little bit worried, I guess, what reaction from the church it might get, and he suggested it as a hypothesis. Like, how about, just for argument's sake, we put the sun at the center. And so in that case, so this is the old system. This is how it looked like. The Earth is here. Of course, the moon circles the Earth, no problemo. But then all the others, you see Mars, Mercury, Saturn, Jupiter, they would have to like make this kind of weird loops. That's the only way to explain them. So when Copernicus suggested that the Earth is not at the center, it became, well, what he thought was perfect circles. It's actually not circles, right? It's elliptical. It's kind of like this. But that's what they discovered later on. So this is one of the first important developments in science. This Copernican model, even though after he died, that kind of for a long time was not really taken very seriously. Book was dedicated to Pope himself. He actually tried to really shield himself from any potential circumstances. Why? Because the church actually at the time was saying that Earth is at the center, because that could only explain many things in the Bible. Like in one point, Bible says that the sun was stopped by Job or whatever, I don't remember. So how could he stop the sun if we are revolving around the sun and not the sun revolves around us, right? How can you stop the sun if the sun is already standing still? So that created a whole bunch of these theological problems, and more or less was not allowed by the church. Later on, another important person, Galileo Galilei, who lived in Italy, actually did get into confrontation with the church, because he published another book quite a bit later in 1632, which actually, instead of saying that this is a hypothesis, described it as a fact. His book, The Dialogue Concerning Two Chief Systems of the World, point blank was just basically saying that the way things work, sun is at the center, the Earth revolves around the sun, and the other planets revolve around the sun as well. Now, when he did that, he got into a lot of trouble with the Pope. He was actually summoned by the Inquisition to Rome. He was forced to stand on his knees, abdicate, to say, I was wrong, sorry, completely wrong, never mind what I wrote, it's all nonsense. And then he was allowed to keep on living and working, but he was also, for the rest of his life, under house arrest in Florence. So wasn't really completely forgiven. So you can see how dangerous that stuff was at the time. But another important thing which Galileo also, his work, introduced was atomism. Remember the atomism? Prior to that, the most prevalent system was the system of Aristotle, and Aristotle didn't think of the world as consisting of atoms. He thought it was just continuum. But beginning from this time, this Epicurean system, remember Epicurus was the first one suggesting that there are tiny little atoms inside of everything, became more prominent, and even more importantly, mathematics. Again, Aristotle was not using mathematics to describe the heaven, the movement of planets and so on. He thought that mathematics is a separate subject. It cannot be mixed up with astrology. Now, Galileo was probably one of the first who thought, hey, why don't we use mathematics, geometry, mathematics, to actually calculate this stuff? So they were already using it quite intensely, which is one of the reasons they were able to figure out that, first of all, the Earth is not at the center, and second of all, that their planetary movements actually are elliptical rather than circular. Also, at that time, they were able to actually look at them through telescope. The telescope was invented, and Galileo was able to see the moon, and much closer than you can do it with the naked eye, and to figure out you can actually have some mountains there and some other stuff which people didn't think existed. So it became more obvious that it's like a little planet. And he also saw Saturn's satellites. There are several little satellites going around Saturn, so he was able to see them with the telescope. Prior to that, it was impossible. Lots of developments. So for our purposes in this class, what is important is that all these developments in science started interfering with this religious outlook, with the traditional outlook, the way during the medieval period everybody, including philosophers, looked at the world around them. It became more problematic. Next time we'll talk about Descartes. I think that the whole class would be better to talk about Descartes. Descartes is a very important figure. So some philosophers, just like Descartes, thought that science and religion can be good neighbors. He was actually trying to kind of put them together and make sure that they work together. However, it was already an important project because, why? Because for many, it became more and more obvious that perhaps science and religion do not work together nearly as well. Because what science tells us actually goes against this religious outlook. In particular, the fact that, the Earth is not at the center, the sun does not revolve around the Earth, and so on. So some philosophers at the time thought that the two approaches to the world could be integrated into some sort of metaphysical system, but some were saying that they are natural enemies. There's no way you can combine the science and philosophy. It was becoming, and religion. It was becoming more and more problematic. Okay, so quickly to discuss this. Do you think we have this kind of problem today? In what ways the relationship between science and religion are an issue today? Can you guys think of any examples? Evolution, exactly, great example. Like in this country in particular, you know that in some states they actually do have a problem with teaching of the evolution. Why? Well, because the Bible says that God created the world in 7 days. So how does evolution fit into this picture, right? How do you combine the theory of evolution with the Bible? Anything else? The Big Bang, well, yeah, know that you can kind of integrate it with generally believing in God, but if you take Bible specifically very literally, lots of things which Bible tells you sound kind of like impossible from the scientific point of view. And you can see how thousands of years ago people could believe that because they didn't know any better, right? But today when we find out about Big Bang and all this kind of amazing scientific stuff, and not only are we told about it, it's not a fairy tale, right? We actually use that in our daily life. We're able to fly into outer space. We're able to create all these amazing computers and so on based on this knowledge. So we know it works. It's not just a fairy tale. And for this reason, it becomes more and more difficult to combine them. So how do you guys view this relationship? Do you think we can combine them, or do you think it is impossible? Okay, so Luis thinks we can combine them. Does anybody disagree? Well, the problem here is, you probably noticed, if you have a particular dogma about whatever religion you take, it's difficult to actually, some of the approaches are like two-truth theory. Like there's a truth of the Bible, there's the truth of science. They should be kept separate. You can believe in God, you can believe in science at the same time. It's just, two different ways, and you should never try to combine them. But for many people it's not good enough, because it's like, well, can there be two truths? Shouldn't there be just one truth? How can we have two different truths? And that creates problems. Yeah, it definitely is not that easy. It's possible. It's possible. Depending on, how inventive you are in explanations. Note that in terms of the Bible, Church accepted most of this stuff. Church no longer tries to argue with the scientists and tell them that the earth is at the center or something like that. They accepted that. They just kind of try to explain it in a way that, well, Bible is allegorical, you cannot take it literally, and so on. But there still should be some sort of boundary there, because if everything is allegorical, then, who is to explain what it actually means? The allegory can be explained in a variety of ways. So it again comes back to the priests basically telling you stuff rather than you finding it out on your own. So this is, of course, problematic. And this problem was growing more and more important. So two figures which we should mention here, Francis Bacon and Thomas Hobbes. I wanted to talk more about Hobbes than Bacon, even though Francis Bacon is considered one of the first empirical philosophers who started the whole empirical approach. What is empirical approach? Again, remember, empiria is experience. So based on experimental approach, he was trying to philosophize, but in an entirely different way. That will become a very, very important thing for all these modern philosophers. Descartes is considered kind of like a key figure of this process. Thomas Hobbes, however, is also interesting, because unlike Descartes, who gave a beginning to this continental philosophy, we'll talk about next time, the rationalism, Thomas Hobbes gave, you may say, Bacon and Hobbes gave the beginning to the British empiricism, British approach from the British Isle, which is quite a bit different. One thing to note immediately, book talks about rationalism and empiricism. We will talk about it more and more and more. Keep in mind one thing. This is anachronistic to use this when we talk about these philosophers. What does it mean, anachronistic? It means they did not use these words. Descartes never said, I'm rationalist. He didn't even know the word rationalist. Hobbes didn't say, I'm empiricist. These words were made up later on, somewhere I think in the 19th century already, to talk about the people who lived several hundred years earlier. So we use them because they are convenient, they help us to kind of put them into this nice little niches in order to understand them better, but they are anachronistic. They don't really represent exactly what people thought of themselves at that period of time. Okay, so Thomas Hobbes. What is interesting about Hobbes? Well, like I said, he started this, you may say he started British empiricism. He was very interesting figure. Mostly his work is important in politics because he is considered one of the first political philosophers in Europe. And we will talk about his work in that field a little bit later. So just a few biographical bits of data. He was born 1588. That's already after Henry VIII in England. That's already Elizabeth the Great. His daughter of Henry VIII was the Queen of England. A son of uneducated vicar, attended Oxford University. Oxford University, just like all universities at the time, were scholastic. They were still doing this whole thing, but they would make you learn Latin language, and then they would make you read Aristotle in Latin and try to square it with the Bible. They did that whole thing. However, more and more people, including Hobbes, were already reacting against it. He hated this approach. He thought that is not a good approach. He thought some different approaches needed. Different approach to science, different approach to philosophy, completely detached from what universities were doing at that time. One of the important events which had an effect on him is civil war in England. Again, a little bit of history here. Civil war actually started around 1642, so a couple of years before that he actually fled to France. What happened after that is in England the parliament beheaded English king. The King of England, Charles I, was beheaded by the parliament. Lots of trouble, kind of a revolutionary situation. Oliver Cromwell was head of the state for a while. He is a head of parliament. So it became like really I guess, first European republic, although they did later restore the king, Charles II, then they also removed him, but that's a little too much history. However, what is important is that Hobbes lived through this whole period, and he was really impressed by it because he saw civil war. He saw what was happening in England in the absence of strong power, which probably influenced his work quite a bit. Eventually he died in 1679, very old man, but before he did that he wrote quite a lot of important work. Now, several important influences on Hobbes was, first of all, Galileo's writings. Remember, we just mentioned Galileo. Galileo, again, was using this kind of geometrical, mathematical approach to science. Hobbes actually met Galileo when he was in Italy. He knew him personally, and he was very impressed. So he was trying to imitate this kind of approach in philosophy, writing in geometrical order, Euclidean geometry. If you take geometry, all these geometrical proofs, he was trying to use that in philosophy. And of course the Civil War again, which started in 1642, also had a rather large effect on his thought. So two most important pillars of his philosophy, empiricism. And again, what is empiricism? That we learn everything from our senses. We learn everything from experience. The difference with Descartes will be Descartes will think that we do have some inborn ideas, which kind of like pre-installed in us by a divine creation. Now, Hobbes did not think we have any such ideas. He thought when we are born like a blank tablet, tabula rasa. There's nothing there. And then we learn everything from experience. So we touch fire, we get burned, we're like, ah! And we don't touch fire again. And so on. Everything we learn comes from experience, including the idea of God. Everything. And another thing is metaphysical materialism. What is materialism? Remember, that's the idea that there's nothing spiritual. Everything is made of matter. Reality is just matter in motion, those atoms. Now, what did actually that lead him to in his philosophy? Well, he was comparing a human being to a machine. This is a quote from Leviathan. For what is the heart but a spring, and the nerves but so many strings, and the joints but so many wheels, giving emotion to the whole body, such as was intended by the Ossifer. So he believed in God. He wasn't an atheist. But what he actually thought is that the entire universe is simply made by God as a clock-type mechanism, which kind of works already on its own. So the idea here is God really does not interfere very much into human affairs. There may be some occasional miracles, but they're extremely rare. For the most part, everything follows the laws of physics. Everything including human beings. So he actually was saying that everything is determined, including our self. So in that case, you do not have freedom of the will. Why not? Well, if everything follows the laws of physics, how can you have freedom of the will for a human being? So he thought human beings more or less just follow, again, this kind of mechanical development of the world. Note that based on this scientific approach, it makes sense. Because the more science was developed, the more it looked like everything follows strict laws. And if everything follows strict laws, how can you have a human being who does not follow them? It seems more and more impossible. Now, Descartes will disagree with that. But from the point of view of Hobbes, it seems like our behavior is completely determined. So how come then we cannot predict it? Well, we cannot predict it is because it's very difficult to figure out this process of human deliberation. So he was comparing it to kind of like yo-yos. You kind of give it a push and it starts going zoom, 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 and then it falls on a particular side. Can you predict which side it will fall on? No, of course not. Can you theoretically be able to predict? Yes. If you knew all the laws of physics, which of course work on that physical body and determine where it will eventually fall, then you'd be able to. Similarly with the coin, right? When you flip in a coin, you cannot predict whether it will be heads or tails. But you know that what actually is happening there is determined by the laws of physics, right? You give it particular energy, it does a particular number of spins in the air, there is a resistance from the air and so on, and then it lands on the ground. So theoretically, you should be able to predict how it will land. It's just that you don't have all this information. Similarly with a human being. He thought theoretically you could predict exactly what human being will do in each and every case. It's just that we don't have that information, which is why it seems to us that human beings are so unpredictable. But in reality, they are completely predictable as long as you have all the information. And that's also where his famous Leviathan, that famous book, comes from, when he starts taking this approach to society as a whole, to the way society works. So, according to Hobbes, society in general, the state, any state exists because people have to give up their power to powerful authority in order to avoid trouble. It's like, note that this Leviathan, this is the cover of one of the first editions of Leviathan. If you look closely, it actually is made up of tiny little human beings. So the idea of Leviathan here is that the state consists of all these human beings, and they give up part of their freedom in order to obtain safety and security from other human beings, because otherwise there would be trouble. So this is this kind of a very mechanical, physical approach in relation to human beings. You look at human beings as this kind of mechanisms, and they interact in a particular way, and you get a predictable results. Human beings are trying to strive for what they think is good, and because of that, there's not enough for everybody, so they kind of get into conflict with each other. You do avoid this kind of chaotic situation. And how do you avoid it? By having a government. The strong government will give you safety and security necessary. Hobbes talks first about this kind of hypothetical state of nature. And by the way, he does not mean this is kind of like the way early society was living. It's just hypothetical. Purely hypothetically, he's saying, imagine there is absolutely no government and no power of any kind. What would happen in this state of nature? People will be fighting each other and trying to each get the bigger share of the pie. Every man has a right to everything. There's no law. There's nothing stopping you. But what will happen? What do you think would happen if we had this kind of situation in a society? Like no law, no police, everyone for themselves. Anarchy and war. He was saying that will be war of everybody with everybody. Because people will actually, well, we can see kind of this situation sometimes emerges when you have breakdown of order, right? Like after Hurricane Katrina, there are people, looters, there are people who are trying to take advantage of this situation. As soon as you have no police, no authority of any kind, you have some people. Obviously, it's not majority of people. He never says everybody would do that. Nonetheless, even if you have like 1 in 100 who would do that, you would have an anarchy. You would have this dangerous situation. So basically, this is what he says, a state of fear. Everybody would be afraid. You would not be able to do anything because, well, like in terms of commerce, in terms of development, having your business and so on, that would not be possible because why would you, for example, try to build your own business if any day somebody stronger can come and take it away from you, right? Why would you want to build a house if you build a house and then somebody comes and takes it away from you? So you wouldn't do anything. You would like have enough to survive, but that's about it. Note that this is also what he actually saw happening during the Civil War, which is one of the reasons. This is a nice quote from Leviathan, which I think worth to be read. So he says, in such condition, there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain. Consequently, no culture on earth, no navigation, no use of the commodities that may be important by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving, removing, such thing as require much force, no knowledge of on the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, which is worst of all continual fear, danger of violent death. The life of a man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. There's a famous quote, which you may have even heard, or at least if you hear it now, this is from Leviathan. Life of a man, nasty, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. This is what the life in this kind of state of nature would be. And for this reason, he's saying we need give up our rights to the powerful government. In fact, he actually is not making any government, not giving to any government any preference. He's saying any government is better than no government at all, even like monarchy, even having just a tyrant of some sort is better than nobody. Because if you have nobody, you have complete mess. But as long as you have some sort of authority, you are much better off. So he does not go into like whether democracy is better than not. This will be case with Locke, and we'll talk about Locke next week. Nonetheless, he is already saying that authority, the state, is necessary. It is something which we all need in order to preserve our rights and preserve the peace. So we give up our rights to that government, not because we enjoy it, but because that way we actually preserve the rest of our rights, right? Such as to possess property. And if you don't like that, if you don't want any government, then you will lose everything and you'll be more poor than if you do. So kind of the answer to the question, why do we pay taxes to the government? Well, because if you don't pay like 30% or whatever to the government, then you'll pay 100% to the bandits and criminals. And that will be much worse. Okay, so the idea here is that the wills of all the people come together into this one powerful will, which is the Leviathan, the state. There must be some coercive power to compel man equally to the performance of the covenants. So, enforcement of contracts, right? Why would you follow up on your word? Suppose you're a businessman, right? You have a word, you give up your word that you will supply some sort of product in exchange for money. You receive the money, and then you may think, I already have the money. Why should I do anything now? Right? So that's where the government has this coercive power to force you. You signed the contract, so you have to provide this service or whatever in exchange for the money. The only way for people to erect such a common power is to confer all their power and strength upon one man or upon an assembly of men. Note, he makes no difference whether it's one man or assembly of men, that may reduce all their wills by plurality of voices into one will. So that is what Leviathan is. This is kind of like this artificial creature, the state, that mortal god as he calls it, which is a type of a social contract theory of government, right? Social contract, again, remember, even Plato mentioned it in his work in Republic. That was something he actually rejected because he thought that's a little bit too selfish of an approach for us to take. Nonetheless, at this point, Hobbes does not see much problem with it. He's saying, yeah, you really not doing it for some sort of greater good. How many people are philosophers? How many people come out of the cave and see the light? Very few. Nonetheless, we all have to obey the law. So he's saying, in that sense, the social contract is you have to obey the law not because of the good outside the cave. You have to obey the law because it's in your best interest. Because that way you will preserve whatever you have and be able to obtain more goods and live better life. And that's as simple as that. The idea also is here that government is not instituted by God. Note that this is already different from the medieval outlook, although it is related to the way Thomas Aquinas thought about that. So it's not like the God is completely removed from the picture, but the idea here is that the power of whoever is in charge, not given by the God, but given by the people for their best interest. People do give up their rights to the government, but they're not doing it because God commanded it. They are doing it because it's in their best interest. So it's kind of an exchange. Social contract. I authorize and give up my right of governing myself to this man or to this assembly of men on this condition, that you give up thy right to him, and authorize all his actions in like manner. So I obey the government and you obey the government. We all obey the government. And even though it is inconvenient for me, but I put up with this inconvenience because you also put up with this inconvenience, and we all put up with this. And thanks to that, we live better than before. Now, the sovereign in this case, according to Hobbes, actually has the absolute power. Once you gave him that power, he has the absolute power. Either he or the group of people, or she, whatever, their power is not limited. Why not limited? Well, he thought that you need very strong government. Only this very strong government, be it group of people or not, will be able to keep peace, because otherwise people will still take matters into their own hands and not listen to the government. He saw the Civil War. What happened during the Civil War? It's not like there was no authority whatsoever. At first there was a king and a parliament, and they were fighting with each other. Then there was parliament. They just did not have enough authority. So he thought that was problematic. Government should have a lot of authority. Now, how much authority government should actually have? This is a very, very current issue, right? Note that here's an interesting problem. We all saw what happened on January 6th, right? Some people, believing that the government is no longer representing them, decided to go and take power into their own hands by forcing basically the Congress to prolong Donald Trump's presidency. Now here's $1 million question, which obviously everybody answers based on his or her political affiliation. Was it the right thing to do? Should we be allowed to do things like that? What do you guys think? Let me see what you think. Okay, but why not? By the way, note that, I'm Russian, right? So I do actually follow the news in Russia. In Russia, they really enjoyed this entire thing, and the way it was looked at by the Russian people is actually this. Note that in the United States and in the West in general, Putin is considered to be a dictator, so there's actually a lot of sympathy for Russian opposition. So essentially there is a support of some sort of a revolution or takeover of the power in Russia, right? The money are given to the opposition. There's all sorts of other support, at least to the degree which they are able to do that. So the way Russian people were responding to this is, so when some people try to storm the capital and take over power in your country, you put them in jail. But when people do that in Russia, you actually think they're heroes. How come? Now, what would be the answer to that? Well, obviously, one way to answer it would be, okay, but Putin has been in power for like more than 20 years now, and it's not democratic. Well, he actually did make his way around the constitution. It is in accordance with the Russian constitution. He did have elections. He won those elections. What's the response to that? The response to that is those elections were not fair, they were fixed. And again, Russian people are saying, oh, wait a minute, but isn't it exactly the charge of people who support Trump? Aren't they are saying that your elections are fixed? Of course, you can say, no, that's nonsense. There's no evidence of that. But the Russian people will tell you, where's the evidence that elections in Russia are fixed? Do you have this evidence? Note that the question here fundamentally is this. When do people have a right to overthrow their government? How do you know? Well, what's enough people? How many people are enough? Let me tell you, 1 million people can overthrow the government. It's very difficult to stop 1 million people. Suppose 1 million people would be marching on Washington now, trying to overthrow the US government. You would have to engage the military. But what if some of them are in the military? In the same time, should it be enough? I mean, we have 320 million people in this country. So can 1 million people dictate to 320 million? I mean, they do say there's about 74 million of Trump supporters. That's a lot of people. So the problem here is, again, and note that I'm not trying to argue any side here, but you can see the problem, hopefully, right? The problem is, when is it justified? Under what circumstances? When can you say that this government is no longer representing us? This government should be overthrown. In some cases, of course, you should be able to say that, but in some cases you should not. So for many people, it really becomes the question of their personal feeling, the way they feel about the government, right? Because we can see now that the statistics, proof, evidence, all of this only works as long as you believe it. Some people say, well, there's absolutely no proof that there was any falsification. And other people are answering, no, there's plenty of proof. How do you reconcile that? Yeah, well, so again, we can't obviously answer this question right now, and it's a little bit more of a subject for political science rather than philosophy. But philosophical question is this, not in this particular situation, not in this country, but in general. In general, when should people be able to overthrow the government? Because prior to this period of time, prior to Hobbes, the idea was never, never. You should not ever overthrow your government. Why not? Government given by God. God decided that this guy, as bad as he is, should be your king. End of story. Who are you to question God? Know that what is happening here is you already are questioning not so much God, but where did the power come from? Who gave power to this person? Why is he in charge? We had elections or something? Well, how fair were those elections? Do they really represent me as the person? Do they represent everybody? So this is a totally different outlook. And this is the beginning of the totally different period in life of Europe and in philosophy, which is also why it is important for us as philosophers to see that and to understand that it was happening. So we can say that Hobbes was a founder of political science and, in a sense, political philosophy. So he was one of the first key figures who put these questions up there. He answered it in this way, that government is needed in order for us to be able to function as society. We're better off under any type of government. But he did not go into details of how this government should be elected. Locke, who we'll talk about next week, actually did go into that. But before we get to Locke, we will have to have next lecture on Descartes. And remember, Descartes, like I said, Descartes actually disagreed with Locke and with Hobbes about many things. Even though he also is this new type of philosopher who actually rejects this medieval approach, but he believes in God, and he actually believes that science and religion can be perfectly well reconciled. They work together very well. So this is what is interesting about Descartes. So if you did not read the chapter on Descartes yet, make sure you read it, because we will talk about him next time, and a lot of stuff there is very, very interesting, and hopefully you will see what an interesting figure he is. So that's all we have for today. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and next time, like I said, we will talk about Descartes. Okay?